Was born in Lethbridge and had gone to school here until halfway through grade 2, and then moved to Medicine Hat for 5-6 years, and then ended up coming back to Lethbridge to do my grade 9, and from that time on had completed my schooling at Catholic Central and then had gone on to the University of Lethbridge. My father was in the produce business. He ran McDonald's Consolidated, which was an offshoot of Canada Safeway. So he went up to Medicine Hat to set up there. Actually, I was rather young when I had gone into university. I was still 16, so my parents had thought that it would be better to continue closer to home, so to speak. And they had a good ball team. Well, I thought they had a rather good ball team, so it seemed like a good option. I played through high school and then had played with the Pronghorns in my first year here. And then unfortunately, my knee wasn't being very kind to me, and that was the end of my ball playing career. Well, in high school, it was always forward and center, and the wonderful world of university, you find out at 6'3½" that now you're playing a guard. It was over on the campus of the college. And we were using basically one building. I was majoring in sciences, and so we were using outside utility trailers for most of our classes. Because we were very small by comparison when we started at the college, that it was a rather collegial, collaborative kind of entity where we were almost like a department within the college. And so playing basketball, for example, I remember running up and down the Cooley Hills for the training. That was with Robin and his philosophy that why invest in a lot of equipment when you have such a great facility like the outdoors that you can use to train your athletes, which was an incredible kind of approach. Coming over to the west side, I think the biggest thing that I saw in terms of that transition was the perceived isolation, because the university was the only thing over here. And I remember going across the bridge, Highway number 3, and then taking the road north-south from the highway to the university. That was the destination. And so it was rather interesting because here again you had almost a family kind of environment that was separate from the others. You know, now you were this unique entity. And I thought that was very interesting.
You like sports, obviously.
I did. I started out actually as a phys ed major until I realized that probably would not, or I was convinced by my parents at least, that I would never be able to find suitable employment with that as a major. I don't think it was the overriding decision, but I also had family in southern Alberta, and I had been close to my grandparents, etc. So it did help to have an institution of this caliber this close to home. What university? That was the, I think it was still somewhat contentious in that the university had been formed and it wasn't so much that the university had been formed, but rather that it was going to become a separate entity from the college. And I think there was still a fair amount of debate around that day. And so not that there was animosity, but it was more an unsureness of, so what's the difference? What's the difference between the college and the university? What's the difference between what people engage in those classrooms? And why is it necessary to have a separate one? I think at the time there was a perception that most people would go to large universities to where colleges met basically sort of the 2+2 kind of program, to where you would do your early training and education at the college and then move on to where larger institutions had the resources available already. The infrastructure was established, so why are you duplicating that? And I think that's one of the real differences, at least now thinking back to those early days, is the liberal arts philosophy really was the distinguishing factor between what someone would engage in here at the University of Lethbridge and what others would or could be seeking to achieve at another institution. So if it's engineering or medicine or law and the like, to where from the very early times, there wasn't the separation that you would find in larger universities between the departments, and especially within the Faculty of Education. Prior to the university being here, I remember riding horses over on this land. And for me, probably one of the things that I thought about as the university was being built was there were sinkholes over here because of the fact that you had mine shafts that underlain a lot of the areas. And so I'm wondering, pretty big building to be putting on top of land that may or may not be that stable. And that was sort of the ethos of what some people were thinking about at the time. But with the Erickson design fitting into the side of the coulee, I think it was absolutely phenomenal. And the only thing that, at least for me, visually, that I was bothered by was after the university had managed to constrain the building component to keep the silhouette below basically the skyline so you could still see the mountains, etc., that then what looked like this phallic symbol in behind it represented by this apartment building that suddenly came up on the other side of University Drive where they had different zoning laws. And for me that always seemed like not only an anomaly but a little bit ridiculous. But I think the university was doing a great job in trying to maintain the architecture within the landscape. Starting in '69, starting at a time when very young, obviously, but by the time I hit my third year of university and moving into my fourth, at that time the university didn't have a Bachelor of Science yet. So even though I was majoring in the sciences, I was going to be getting at the end of that a BA, a four-year BA in chemistry. And I personally thought that was rather ludicrous, but at the same time, that's all that was available. And what had taken place during that same time period, I used to fly with my father, and one of my friends had told me that they were looking for nav air pilots for the Canadian Forces. And I thought, wow, that would be kind of neat. And had gone up to a recruiting office in Calgary and had taken their exams, done extremely well with those, and found out that I could go in as a direct entry officer because I had at least 3 years university. And so going through that process, I went through the officer training as an officer training candidate in Chilliwack in the early 70s and graduated in '74 from that training program and had continued on in the forces. But unfortunately, since the aircraft carrier that we had was scrapped, then all officers at that time were interchangeable. You could be moved from one part of the force to the other. So I landed up in the Navy on destroyers, which was an incredible experience. I mean, just the officer candidate school, where you come in with 133 and we graduated 29. So the mortality rate was incredible, but what you did, in my case, was it really changed from a precocious young man more into a young man that had a lot of confidence and a lot more, I guess today we just say, the ability to apply ourselves and think forward to a future. And that's where coming back to the University of Lethbridge then to complete my BA BSc, because my BSc portion was actually in Earth Sciences. And I think I've shared that one of two people that actually completed the Earth Science program before it was no longer a viable entity. It was very resource-laden because you actually did a sort of a minor in 3 or 4 different areas. And so it took a fair amount of orchestration for the individual involved. Having said that, that background, because it really did lend itself for my interest in the environment, et cetera, and having the earth science background, that then continuing on into education. And I'll never forget one of my professors, Professor Chip Beatty in geology, who was a mentor of mine at the time, And I had told him that I was thinking of combining this with an education degree. The chagrin that in those days, to take a degree and have a strong geology background, you could write your ticket to wherever you wanted to go in terms of engineering, geological engineering. Why would I go into education? And I think for me, one of the things that I did find was that I was very unhappy with how, sorry, this one I'm going to have to think about before I can continue on, but how to say this diplomatically. At that time, the education system that I had come through, we had 100% departmentals in grade 12, which meant that basically everything you did in class was for naught, because all you had to do was do well on the departmental, and that's where your grade came from. And that bothered me, especially in the sciences. So a lot of people didn't take, my perception was, a lot of people didn't take advantage of the labs that were offered. There wasn't a whole great deal of inquiry that was available. There weren't a lot of opportunities in terms of field trip components. You know, the heavy emphasis on sports and athletics, music, etc., but not really around that aspect. And that's the part that interested me, because from very early stage with young people, show me a child that doesn't like warm, fuzzy creatures. And usually there has to be a specific reason why that has taken place, because there is that affinity for nature. So building on the resources I had, because I went through a liberal arts institution with that focus on the sciences, I had a more integrated understanding of what science and science education could be. So with the excellent faculty that we had available here, and at that time, Eric Mokosh had a great influence. He was the one that taught the science education programs, that it really shaped a way of thinking for me, and especially with the tutelage of Eric, who went on to be the dean, had really focused on what we now refer to as, you know, teachers as leaders, is that you are there to affect change in the classroom. You are a leader. And so one of the tasks that you engaged in was trying to ensure that you provide the best learning environment you could for the students that you were working with, whatever grade level that happened to be. So I think that the University of Lethbridge had an incredible impact on them, what I was interested in. And with that, of course, those were the days with smaller classes, teaching in rural schools as well, because I preferred that over teaching in Lethbridge, because I could literally walk out of our school and into a field. And so a field trip was not a big thing. It was just taking your kids out of the classroom. And that's the part that I remember most and that I loved the most, which led to my involvement then with the environmental and outdoor education. I think one of the things about the University of Lethbridge was because of our size, much smaller at the time, and there was no real demarcation in terms of professor, student, in terms of a rigid structure. What my professors did was they earned your respect. So that was where the hierarchy came in, was you respected these individuals, and thereby, in most cases, they became your mentors rather than just another professor. And so I was very fortunate to have some key individuals that I worked with that allowed that and encouraged me to go forward. It was actually Eric that came into my classroom one day. He had students placed with me when I was teaching out of Sterling. And he had convinced me that I probably had affected about as much change in a couple of districts I'd been in as I was going to. And wouldn't it be neat if I could go on and teach teachers? And I was very interested in that at the time. It sounded like a great idea. And so I actually had gone on directly into a PhD program at the University of Alberta. The irony is that at that time, in 1980, even though I started out in the PhD program, they had just started putting into place a new structure where you had to do your master's before you could continue into a PhD, whereas before you could go directly from your baccalates, if you had dual baccalates on. And so my master's thesis was actually my PhD thesis on Canadian context and science education. And so the neat thing was I was able to build at the one level and then continue on with that. And within that Canadian context, another individual that was going through these programs at the same time, Frank Jenkins from Edmonton, Frank was focused on a science technology society focus with his supervisor, Doug Roberts. And so with Marshall Ney, we sort of this coalescing of this Canadian context and the Science Technology Society led to work with the Science Council of Canada that then became our STSE focus, with environment being included in that as well. And so similar to Eric's involvement, encouraged me to go on because that's where he and his advisor from the University of Alberta, he had in 1985 come up to the University of Alberta and encouraged me to think about coming back to the University of Lethbridge because he was going on to administration and they needed a science educator. And it wasn't just a science educator. What he was looking for was we had put forward proposals to the Alberta government to start a Centre of Excellence in Environmental Education. And so Eric was the one who had basically arranged with the University of Alberta to free me from my contract from them and come back here in 85, 86 to continue on in the Faculty of Education. From those early days in '69, when I came back, basically in 1975, 76, I came back and I was heavily involved in not only my studies, but also within the Students' Union and with the folks in the sort of 1977 time period. We had worked towards establishing a Student Union Building Fund. And so at my time when on the Board of Governors as a Student Union representative, working then in a number of those different capacities, I continued forward in 78 to 82 as alumni president. And there again, building on those earlier experiences, being on the Board of Governors, being on the Senate, having been involved in so many different roles, it was natural for me to keep working with the university prior to coming back. So I was teaching in the summers for the University of Lethbridge from about 82, actually 81 on to 85. So then when I did come back as a full-time professor, I think for me the biggest thing that I noticed, and this was even then in the 80s, was the changes that were occurring because of the growth of the institution. And not that there was more of a rigidity in the departmentalization, but just that the campus was growing as well. So from going from that one main building that we had for most of the faculties and schools, of course, because we did have the, at that time, they had the phys ed building, right, which was the first structure. And then as we could talk about later, we had this wonderful tunnel from the phys ed building on down to the main University Hall. But then you had the tunnel actually leaving the scene when we had the Fine Arts building that had been built. And so as these changes started happening, you saw that there wasn't as much of the same concentration of the students and the professors in the same area. And so with that, you saw that there was a little bit more of the departmentalization that was happening and the separation of some of the faculties. I think that really came to the fore when the Faculty of Education moved as well. That you begin to realize that with the sizes that we have, in order for faculties to operate, it's not that they isolate themselves, but that you have a big enough community that you focus within that community, so you don't have as much of the crossover going on into the other areas. I think that was one, was the size. The other, the change definitely that had taken place in the last 20, 25 years is the emphasis on the research. Is that the research was always a given. Professors always had the three components, which was their community, the teaching, and the research. But with more emphasis being placed on the research element, it seemed that, and it wasn't I guess, just a natural kind of erosion that would take place through a lot of the retirements of some of the founding faculty, etc. But people were coming into the institution with more of a focus on their research than on their teaching. So for us as a faculty, to where we count on good teaching across all faculties, because those are the students that feed into our program, that you could see that just with the increased size numbers and with some of those changes in dynamics, that there wasn't the same kind of overall community that there had been before. And so I think that folks at a lot of different levels, including the senior administration, Students' Union, many others, have tried to continue to develop that kind of collegiality and collaborative nature, but now it's taking a lot more work, where it was a natural thing before. I think from the point of view of the Faculty of Education, my returning was very much a conscious, deliberate decision. I went from the University of Alberta to where I had, as a science educator, I had all the resources I could want. And to a place to where, I never forget Eric saying to me, don't forget to bring your microscope with you. I didn't have 40 or 45 microscopes used in my class, but what I did have was the ability to go down the hall and talk to my colleagues in biology and chemistry. Can I borrow these? Can we use these? So there was a certain type of connectivity there. And then as the sizes, et cetera, an increase, as we just mentioned, had occurred, some of that there was a separation. But I do see more and more of that taking place with a focus on what is it we do as a liberal arts institution that's different. So a lot of the interdisciplinary studies, a lot of the interdisciplinary research that's now coming forward, I do see that as sort of trying to return to that. And for the Faculty of Education, to its credit, I think with the increase in pressure and size, there has been a dynamic change in the perception of the Faculty of Education. The faculty seems to have done very well through time in maintaining its academic standards and how others view it in terms of the credibility of our graduates. The one thing that has changed remarkably is the portion of the overall university population that we represent. So from going from about 1/3 of the students to where now we're what, 1/8, 1/9? I mean, even the Faculty of Management is larger than we were. And the Faculty of Management didn't exist then. I mean, it was the School of Management at one time, and then growing from there. So I think that has changed somewhat in terms of perceptions and some of the dynamics of our relationships. But in terms of the field itself, I don't think that has changed at all. If anything, it's stronger than it ever was. I think people are now beginning to realize that that relationship is one of the true strengths of our program. The practicum is one of the differentiating factors in terms of the employability of our students. So I'd have to say bravo to the faculty in doing that. Well, that one's easy, really. When there was the focus specifically on the undergrad program, I think that one of the difficulties for people engaging in their own research was they didn't have, because of the fact that in many cases we are singular in nature. In other words, as an art person or as a science person, there may be one colleague, if you're lucky, that you can collaborate or work with within this working environment. Because many of us now, today, it doesn't matter because of the emerging technologies, we collaborate with our colleagues all over the world. But at that time, that was rather difficult. So the advent of a graduate program, I think, was a very good move forward, in that now you're engaging in a dialogue about your area of expertise at a different level. It's not the undergrads, the pre-teacher component. You're talking to teachers that are engaged in this ongoing situation day in and day out. This is their lived world, and you get to share in that. And so I think that was an excellent move. I think one of the challenges was what size should that be in order to allow that growth, allow that collegial development with our master's students, and yet at the same time be able to dedicate the time to them and to our undergrad program, so we can maintain the integrity of both. And as we move forward to the doctoral program, I see the same question being front and center. Okay, how many can we actually bring on board? What is the optimum? Not just for the candidates, because we have that responsibility to all of our, whether you want to call them students, participants in our program, whether they're undergraduate, master's, or doctoral. The seriousness of that commitment becomes a little more as you move up that line, because your undergrads are with us in the faculty for basically 2 years because of the combined degree program. The masters, 2 to 3 years. Now you start moving to the doctoral, and you're trying to establish a strong environment for those candidates that could range from 4 to 7 years. And so it's quite a commitment, and something you have to do very consciously. But I see the blending opportunities of doctoral candidates working with masters, working with their undergrads, as being a fantastic opportunity for the faculty. The role of a teacher. Well, we banter about all these things like 21st century learning. I think that we have modified and changed our teaching techniques, our techniques of engagement throughout the full time period that certainly I've been working on my teacher education, because it doesn't end. And as an educator, for me, it's, I guess the mentorship aspect is a big one, to where we're facilitators. There's so much within the science area, it's very easy to admit this, because there's just been an absolute explosion of the knowledge base within the sciences. So you are no longer the purveyor of the information. And one of the nice things about the University of Lethbridge was, because of the orientation of the program, that was modeled for me from the very beginning. Very few people lectured. What they would do, the expectation was there. You were provided with the readings, you were provided with the information available to you, or the tools to get the information. And there was a so what? So what now? It was the expectation, now you were going to do something with this. You were going to apply it. So for the teacher and educators, ourselves, engaging, it's engagement. It's providing that hook. It's getting the person excited about this, because all we have to do is call it dialing it up, whether it's on your iPhone, your iPad, or your computer. The information is right there. What are you going to do with it? So I think what we do is we are the mentors, we are the cheerleaders, we are the people to try and help youth, our colleagues, overcome the barriers. If there are challenges there, whether they're physical, emotional, societal, that we do our best to try and help someone work their way through to achieve their goals as it relates to education. My fondest memories were related to the field components in my undergrad. I can remember sitting on a hillside with Hiroshi, who now people are realizing is an incredible artist. And Hiroshi is attempting in this field course to teach me how to sketch. My mind works in the way that I could draft something for a construction site very easily. Give me a T-square, I'm fine. But the freehand, oh, you've got to be kidding me. The patience, the enjoyment, and then the next minute being off tromping through marshes or ponds, you know, with my professors in biology, or tromping the hillsides with Chip Beatty, and just having these, because I'm biology, I'm talking about Job Kite and some of those folks, having these wonderful people available to you, and it was like working with one of your friends. And I think that's my fondest memory. And that was really the modeling for me that set that in place in my heart, saying that's what I would like to do right to the end. And that's where that mantra that some of my students probably hate by this point in time, try to keep telling them that only through action does knowledge become wisdom. So you've got to do it. Don't talk about it. Get out there and do it. That's my fondest memory.